Hello, I'm Erik Wait, and this is lesson 12 in our study of the law of God. And in this lesson, we'll be considering the law of God versus situation ethics. In most formal debates, both sides of an argument are usually open and upfront as to where they are coming from theologically and philosophically on the issue at hand. The problem is that most people, when they get into debates, are often, say, completely unaware as to how they have been influenced by the culture and their education background, whether it is from a school, a local church, or popular media. The result is they can often think and act in such a way that is in accord with a particular school of thought and yet be totally unaware as to where the ideas in their worldview come from. This is why it is important to understand the history of philosophy and theology when developing a distinctly Christian worldview. When you hear certain ideas being asserted, you need to be able to recognize them, know where they originated, their inherent fundamental flaws, and how to respond to them with Scripture. But if you're having a discussion with people who don't know where their ideas come from, then you can't expect them to say, well, I'm a relativist, I'm a moral positivist, I'm a rationalist, I'm an existentialist. The fact is, most people don't know where they're getting their ideas from, or that there is a label for the school of philosophy that they are espousing. They just sort of absorb these ideas and thoughts like a sponge from their environment, their educational upbringing around them. Now, when antinomians or theoretical antinomians, people who are against the law of God, are pressed for a basis for right and wrong, especially those claiming to be evangelicals, they will appeal to a form of situation ethics with a vague notion that, well, Christians are to live by love, not law. Consequently, any appeal to the law of God, his commandments, ordinances, or rules, are flatly rejected, even if they come from the New Testament. In essence, they argue that the only law for Christians is the law of love, or law of Christ, which they wrongly assert is not equated with anything written in the Old Testament. While the New Testament certainly speaks of love as the royal law, James 2:8, and the law of Christ, 1 Corinthians 9:21 and Galatians 6:2, it roots these laws in the Old Testament, specifically in the heart of the holiness code found in Leviticus 19:18. Modern antinomians assert that when they are making moral ethical decisions, they are to walk by the Spirit rather than search the Scriptures to discern God's will on the matter at hand. And so they like to quote that phrase from Paul, we're not under the law, we're not under the law, we're not under the law, to mean that we don't have to obey any of God's commands in the Old Testament, in the Gospels, or even from the Apostle Paul. So it's kind of weird if the Apostle Paul were to quote the Old Testament, an Old Testament commandment, which he frequently does, to them, they would respond to Paul, who uses the phrase, not under law, in his epistles to the Romans and Galatians, but Paul, we're not under the law. Dude, the problem is you don't understand and know what that phrase means. And I covered that in the last two lessons, in the lessons on not under the law in Romans and not under the law in Galatians. Now, of course, all this begs the question as to how do you know whether or not you are walking in the Spirit, which Paul states to do so is to crucify the flesh with its passions and desires, Galatians 5:25. And how can you know whether or not you're living according to the law of love while rejecting the Old Testament as any objective standard for Christian morality, which is the very source for the New Testament's law of love, Galatians 5:14. In essence, antinomians want to use the Old Testament's law of love, found in Leviticus 19:18, which is repeatedly upheld by the New Testament, like climbing Wittgenstein's ladder, only to throw away God's law once they've arrived. What antinomians actually assert in their use of the term law of love is not in accordance with the New Testament, what it means by that term. Rather, it is an ethical philosophy known as situation ethics that asserts that the ruling norm of Christian decision is love, nothing else, and hence love is the only norm for ethics as love replaces law. Antinomians will dismiss even the New Testament's appeal to the Old Testament commandments when they are in conflict with their new morality, which eschews any objective standard for Christian conduct on a misconceived notion that the New Covenant emphasizes relationship over the objective law of God contained in the vows of the covenant, which are the binding stipulations for that relationship. This idea of relationship over objective morality or love pitted against law was popularized in the 1960s by Joseph Fletcher in his book Situation Ethics, The New Morality. And although it has been refuted on numerous occasions, it continues to be a popular idea, particularly amongst experience-oriented evangelicals and theoretical antinomian dispensationalists. When situation ethics are used in Christian morality, it sets the subjective personal social context for relationships against the rightness or wrongness of specific acts as stated in Scripture. This is an untenable means of establishing a justifiable system of ethics, for although the context, that is the situation, may affect the degree of culpability for a wrong act and determine which commandments are applicable, an objective normative standard for morality is needed in order to establish any justifiable universal standard for what may be called right or wrong. In fact, situation ethics is rooted in an attempt to avoid a system of ethics, a moral code, set of rules and principles, and instead appeals to philosophical pragmatism, that the desired ends is the sole basis for justifying one's actions. It subsequently asserts that any appeal to any objective standard for Christian ethics, particularly the Old Testament, is tantamount to legalism. The problem with situation ethics is that the Bible reveals a God to whom some acts are wrong, whatever the context is associated with them. A loving motive, as important as it is, cannot override God's objective standard, that is, the moral requirements of the law, for right and wrong, which reflects his holy character. Therefore, while sinful behavior feels natural to someone, it is contrary to God's set boundaries, as he has repeatedly throughout history judged those who violated his holiness, whether or not they were in covenant with him. As we read the Bible, we need to keep in mind several important points regarding God's law, particularly in the Old Testament. First, not everything that is legal is good. Second, there is a hierarchy of laws such that if the higher law of loving one's neighbor is followed, following the lesser laws that allowed for divorce or slavery within certain boundaries would not be necessary. In other words, the law of God in the Old Testament provides a hierarchy of laws such that if you obeyed a higher law, then you would not need to follow many of the lower laws, such as those regarding the treatment of slaves, because love would lead you to treat a slave as a kinsman. We find this in Paul's epistle to Philemon, for example. Furthermore, if you truly loved your wife or daughter according to the higher law, you would not need laws regarding the manner in which one might sell a daughter into slavery. The Old Testament law did not provide a means for creating a utopian society, but rather, like a bandage that protects a wound until the arrival of the physician, so too the Old Testament social laws kept many less than ideal social functions and statuses in place, such as slavery and polygamous marriages. But the redemptive historical trajectory from the Old to the New Covenant placed greater restrictions on slavery, polygamy, and divorce, and upheld the one man, one woman relationship as the ideal which leaders, particularly priests and elders, were required to obey to set an example for all of God's people. So, Jesus, for example, he says, look, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted divorce. But then he says, but I tell you, this is not how it originally was so. And if you, for unwarranted reasons, divorce someone, or if you marry someone who was divorced, who did not have a lawful divorce, namely due to adultery, then you are committing adultery. So the fall of mankind brought sin and disorder to the earth, to society. The law sets a trajectory in which it's hedging in these the results of the fall, such as death, adultery, polygamy, same-sex acts, and so forth, and slavery. And the law is actually getting more restrictive because it's going back to God's original intent. And so, where the Pharisees were hypocritical and taught contrary to the law of God, we read this in Matthew chapter 5 to 7, which I covered in previous lessons. Jesus is bringing the law back to its original intent. The normative standard, the situation, and the right response. Every ethical circumstance requires a normative standard that provides the moral principles to be applied to this specific situation and a right response from those needing to make the ethical decision. In the Christian worldview, the normative standard is the law of God found in the Old and New Testaments. As discussed in previous lessons, the entirety of God's law is applicable unless directly, or by good and necessary consequence, he has revealed that the law is no longer required to be obeyed. Such laws include those that were typological of Christ, such as the sacrificial system, and those laws which made a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, such as circumcision. I covered this in previous lessons. The law of God also provides numerous case laws which provide examples of how the principle of the law should be applied in the New Covenant context, such as when Paul cites Deuteronomy 25:4 as a moral requirement to support those who work in the ministry. See 1 Corinthians 9:9 and 1 Timothy 5:18. Our feelings, our level of comfortability, are not an indication that a choice is right. Many people, even Bible-believing Christians, will claim, well, I felt right about it in my spirit when making a moral decision, which may actually indicate the level of the depravity of their heart. As the prophet Jeremiah said, the heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? Jeremiah 17:9. This is why it is extremely important that we have a biblically informed conscience. As the psalmist wrote, I have treasured your word in my heart so that I might not sin against you. Psalm 119:11. So this is why it is really important to train up a child in the way in which he should go, with the law of God, with the Proverbs, so that they will have a right, informed conscience, right? So rather than absorbing from the world and its philosophies and its antinomian ways of thinking, which are, just contrary to the law of God, to all of Scripture, they have an informed conscience so they can have a spirit of discernment between understanding and choosing decisions that are right and according to God's will versus the will of Satan. Alrighty, I hope you have learned from this lesson and have been blessed. And until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.